of the El Paso shooting. Exactly 1 year ago today, we sadly saw a tragedy that hit one of the strongest, safest cities in America. 85% of the folks that live in El Paso are Latino. We saw a tragedy when someone decided that they wanted to send a message to all Latinos in this country by jumping into their car and driving 10 hours to cause maximum pain and maximum harm. The El Paso shooter in his creed said that he wanted to stave off the Mexican invasion and stop the Hispanic voting bloc. And I'm just paraphrasing. This conversation is particularly personal to me because just a week before, I had been playing in that same mall with my 2 children. El Paso is a community of resilience, of love, of fierceness that is mourning for an incident that it did not instigate. So this afternoon, I welcome into a conversation people that don't need any introduction for the incredible work that they're doing day in and day out. But I'd like to introduce you to Congresswoman Veronica Escobar. She is one of 2 Latinas that represent the great state of Texas, who represents the great state of the district of El Paso, but more importantly, has brought compassion and truth to the reality of El Paso. I would also like to introduce Amanda Schuerman, who is part of the March for Our Lives, who is out of Phoenix, Arizona, who speaks to the importance of addressing this very issue of who has access to guns and who are the individuals disproportionately impacted by their use. And someone who I admire for her tenacity to continue leading from El Paso and now on the national stage. Please join me in welcoming also Brianna Carmen. She is Voto Latino's National Director for Partnerships. And we are here today to have a frank, honest discussion to commemorate those we lost, but make sure that the individuals that we're grieving and mourning for today, that their lives were not lost, but instead it provides an impetus for conversation against hate, conversation for action, and a conversation to ensure that El Paso does not happen in our communities again. With that, let me introduce to you Congresswoman Veronica Escobar.
Thank you so much, Maria Teresa, and so wonderful to be with all of you, Brianna and Amanda, and everyone watching at home. I want to thank you for not just this conversation, but for all the leadership that Voto Latino has provided. I literally just got home about an hour ago from an incredibly powerful community event. We've had more than one event today. We had events last night, and it's very clear that 1 year later, the community is still in a significant amount of pain. The trauma has been overwhelming, really, but the love of the community, the love of El Pasoans is strong. And as you mentioned, Maria Teresa, it is so important that we talk about what brought us this day. This day didn't just happen. And there were many events, and I know we'll talk about it through our conversation, many events that led up to this day, many words that led up to this day. And until we confront them, then we will not stop the tragedy, the racism, the hate, and division. And so these conversations are important for that reason, especially.
Thank you. Amanda, I want to start a little bit with you because I think that's absolutely right. One of the biggest challenges we have in this conversation is that it's also given us an opportunity to come together and support each other in this way. The March for Our Lives has created a movement of young people who have demonstrated what happens when, even if you can't vote, how you can make transformational change. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, when I started working with March for Our Lives, I was a junior in high school. I was 17. I was working at the elections, even though I couldn't even vote. I was out there registering voters. And that's something so interesting about our movement. You're right. It is a lot of students that don't even have the power to vote, but you see how much they care about their democracy and how much they care and love their communities, that they just really want to make some sort of change. So even though we might not have that power at the ballot box, all of our organizers are super invested in their communities and in community organizing, and they're making change in so many revolutionary ways. But this year specifically, this election year, Gen Z really does have that voting power. I'm 19 now. When I started organizing with March for Our Lives, I couldn't vote, but now I can. There's hundreds of thousands of students just like me all across the country that are taking that action and that power and that pain that we've felt, seeing tragedy after tragedy, and we are taking it to the ballot box now. So you'll see us in our communities organizing, but you'll also see us at the ballot box voting.
And Amanda, talk a little bit about how did the El Paso shooting incident impact you and March for Our Lives?
Yeah, just the devastation of seeing your community in so much pain and the people you love in pain, it holds a lot of power. And so over the past year, we've seen activists and organizers across the country, not just in El Paso, not just in Texas, but across the entire country come together to shift that pain into action. And we've been organizing nonstop at the local and at the national level in order to make sure a tragedy like this never happens again. We've been pushing for a lot of common sense gun reform legislation, and specifically legislation that disarms hate. We all know that hate crimes are on the rise, and a lot of violence is being targeted towards the Hispanic community. People who commit hate crimes should not be allowed to have access to these lethal weapons that enable them to commit violent crimes as a result of their biases. So we're really fighting with all we have for this change, not only at the local level, but also at the national level.
Well, and what a change and what a fight that you have brought, because I think we're for the very first time actually seeing legislative impact that we hadn't seen in 25 years. But before we move on to solutions, I want to talk a little bit with you, Brianna. I know that this was something that was so personal to you. This was your hometown. I remember speaking to you the day that it happened and just touching base, and it happened so quickly that I think we were all so numb. Talk about that moment and then today and what you've seen, how you've seen El Paso transpire and change.
Yeah, so that moment really was the coming to life of your worst fears, where you are sitting watching on TV, realizing that it's a place that you recognize, that someone had so much hatred for you, your family, the way that you look, without even knowing you, to come drive over 600 miles to attack a community that is predominantly Latinx. As you mentioned, we're over 85% Latino or have a Latino heritage. And so for someone to hate you so badly without even knowing you was incredibly traumatic, and just a realization and a wake-up moment to really the America that we're currently living in, some of the worst things that we're facing. I think El Paso was a deadly combination of racism, hate, access to lethal weapons, and really someone who had intention to harm and kill. And I think, when I share my love of El Paso with other people, and I'm sure Congresswoman Escobar, you can attest to this, El Paso to me is such a unique spot where there are a few places around the country that I've been where everyone is so welcoming. I say hi to people walking down the street. I smile at them. I am not afraid to walk around any part of the community. I have a deep love and respect for people. And I think that's really bred out of our Latinx heritage, where you welcome and you treat strangers as families. Mm-hmm. So I think what was so terrible was to have someone who wanted to harm a community that would have welcomed them with open arms. And I think it really wakes us up and acknowledges that we've seen hate crimes and white nationalist groups rise by 55% since 2016, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. So it's time for us to acknowledge that things are changing, or maybe we're waking up to something that's always been there, and now it hits home and we need to do something about it.
Right. And Brianna, when you say that El Paso is one of the most welcoming places, I have to underscore El Paso is the only place where I have sneezed and every single person in line has unanimously said, bless you. It is really a place that people call home. And it was perhaps one of the reasons why this tragedy was so compounded. And, Congresswoman, one of the things that when you were in the midst of it, everyone could feel your pain, but you were also so stoic. And we know that in the creed that the El Paso massacre, the person who actually did this, one of the things that he cited was the president's tweets over and over again in this manifesto that he called. And yet the media didn't want to actually acknowledge that he was inspired by the person in the White House. And when the person in the White House went to El Paso, you did something very different from many officials. You refused to sit with him. Talk about that.
You know, I feel very strongly that words have power, and beyond the words that the president has used, where he's described Mexicans as rapists, where he's described immigrants as an invasion, as animals, he has also implemented policies that dehumanize immigrants. I mean, Maria Teresa, you were in El Paso 2 years ago, over 2 years ago, as we were protesting the unaccompanied minors that were being housed in Tornillo. You know, El Paso has been ground zero for so much of the president's xenophobia, his racism, and his hatred. And so the day that we learned, the day of the shooting, the massacre, we learned that same day that the killer confessed that the reason he did it was to target Latinos, to target Hispanic communities. And for me, instantly, the line came straight from the White House to the heart of that killer. When you use those words, when you inflame that hate, you inspire violence. There's no getting around that. And so when I heard that the president was coming to El Paso, I immediately felt very protective of the community, and immediately said he should not come. And when he was determined to come, his office actually reached out to my office and said that I could be in his motorcade if I wanted to. So our response was, before we will even consider that, I wanted a phone conversation with him. He had already called the mayor, he had called the governor. I wanted a phone call. On that day, he had nothing on his schedule. And I wanted to have a conversation with him about the responsibility that he had as the highest leader in the land to retract his statements, to take back his words, to acknowledge their power and their harm. And that in doing that, he could actually promote incredible healing. He could actually unify us and bring us together. He could call on others to stop using racist language and behaving in hateful, divisive ways. That's what I wanted to tell him. But on a day when he had nothing on his calendar, the response that we got back was, he's too busy to call her. So we responded, okay. I said, I'm not going to be a prop. I don't think you should come into this community unless you have remorse, unless you have compassion, and unless you are willing to accept responsibility and retract those words. Without that, I will not be a prop. And so I refused to participate. And we had a counter rally instead.
And I think it's really important to emphasize is that the people he did make time for, the elected officials that you mentioned, the governor and the mayor, they were of the Republican Party. And they weren't showing the respect to El Paso's highest elected official, which is you, Congresswoman, that could actually speak to the issues and the strength and the resilience, but also the mourning, the grief, and the concern of the community. And with that, Amanda, I would love to just to hear from you as how the work perhaps may have transformed because of what happened in El Paso when it comes to March for Our Lives. Because this was a community that oftentimes in the Latino community, while we know that gun violence is an issue, it's often very much not highlighted. Has your work been transformed because of the El Paso shooter and what happened there?
Absolutely. The El Paso shooting was just so tragic, not only because of the lives that were lost, but because of the lives that were lost due to this hatred that we're seeing spread across the country like wildfire. We're seeing it happen in so many other ways. Brianna, I know you mentioned that hate crimes have risen by about 55% since 2016. And you have to sit and wonder why. Why are people inspiring so much hatred right now? Why is the answer to violence more violence? We just can't create a world that's free from violence with leaders that excuse and perpetrate and create this violence in the first place. So when we recognize that, our actions have shifted a lot in the past year. We've been doing a lot more of the direct actions, a lot more civil disobedience and protesting, because we need our voices out there. Right now is the critical time in this nation. We have a chance to shift all of this, to shift away from violence towards peace and justice. And we have to make sure that we're out there fighting on the ground as hard as we can.
Brianna, how has the work that you've dedicated yourself, how has that changed?
I think, for me, organizing work and working in the Latinx space has always been personal, but El Paso brought it to a whole nother level where it was this community that I thought was always safe. It's cited as one of the safest places in the nation. It is safe because of the immigrants that live there and raise their families there. And to realize that, the world that I was operating in wasn't necessarily the way that reality works. I would not have thought that, gun violence or white supremacy would have visited El Paso, but it made me realize that we were operating with, people who are just evil and really inspired and incited to violence by the words that we're using. I think a few years back, there was this whole debate around policing rhetoric, where do these words really matter? How we treat people, how we talk about them, that really has no impact on, children who are in cages or people crossing over the border. And you start to realize through living in these moments, putting the puzzle pieces together, that we were walking a path towards what happened in El Paso, and it could have been any community. And I think that realization just inspires me so much more to, really bring my whole self and my passion into this community to prevent, another act of violence like what El Paso experienced in the places that Voto Latino works in.
And Brianna, I think you touched upon a couple of things, that the violence that happened in El Paso, Representative Escobar, was not just in El Paso. We are seeing it happen across all communities. As a leader, not just of El Paso, but as a leader of the country, a voice that were part of the change that young people voted in 2018, talk a little bit about what you're seeing right now in this moment of the impact that hate is having in the broader community and in the broader country.
And you're right. I mean, this was not just an attack on El Paso. It was also an attack on all Latinos across the country. But it also, the way that we recognize domestic terrorism and terrorist attacks, we need to make sure that the country recognizes this as a terrorist attack, and we need to see it as a national tragedy, an attack against America. And so, we are doing what we can to uplift that. We have a healing garden that the county of El Paso is building, and we have a bill. I filed a bill last week to have the U.S. Congress mark that as a national memorial. And so we need to make sure that when these attacks happen against our community, that we tell America this was an attack on America, because we are integral to who America is and to American values. But one of the things that I'm seeing is that pain that continues to reverberate. El Paso has experienced what mental health experts have told me is compound trauma. So first, it was children in cages in our own community who had been ripped from the arms of their parents, and then the absolute inhumane conditions that vulnerable migrants were being held in, all that we were having to bear witness to, we were protesting against, we were sounding the alarm for the country. And then August 3rd, the attack, which, as you know, devastated all of us, took 23 innocent lives, injured dozens others, but impacted us for all eternity. And then now COVID, which in Texas is disproportionately impacting Latino communities. In El Paso, in fact, we are dying at per capita rates that are at the top of the state. So it is trauma after trauma after trauma. And I am really worried for the mental health of our community. I'm really worried about how much more, how heavy a burden Our folks are already caring. And I want to take this opportunity for any El Pasoans out there who are listening. If you know of someone who needs help and who's in pain, or if you yourself are in pain, you do not have to suffer alone. There is a 24-hour crisis line here locally with Emergence Health Network, and that number is 915-779-1800. We are here to help. This pain is enduring and powerful. We will get past it, but I want folks to reach out for help when they need it.
And Congresswoman, can you say that number one more time, please? And then we will go ahead and share it along, not just in the Voto Latino follow-up, but also across our socials for folks who are seeking national help. Can you repeat that number, please?
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. 915-779-1800. 24 hours, Emergence Health Network crisis line.
Thank you, Congresswoman. So you pulled out two things that I want to underscore, but the first one is oftentimes in the Latino community, our biggest challenge is that we suffer in pain, we suffer in silence. The idea of acknowledging mental health as an issue in our community within our own homes is oftentimes seen as vulnerable and not something that we respect or recognize. And so really highlighting this right now is important. And I would like to just have Amanda, if you want to talk a little bit about the conversation even among young people in March for Our Lives, because I know it's something that you have also explored very much, if you want to touch upon, because I think that the more people could get the mental health resilience that they need during really troubling times, the stronger we could be to come together in November.
Absolutely. And when you think about it, this mental health crisis that we're experiencing, it's the result of all of this systemic oppression that our communities are facing. We're, as you mentioned, we have all of these compound traumas that are happening. So many things that are targeting specific groups. It's amazing how resilient we've been, but we need to be more open to discussing mental health. I'm so glad that you brought up that number for the Emergence Health Network. It's so important to recognize that a lot of the physical symptoms and that you may be experiencing can be a result of this compound trauma that you've been facing as a result of being a part of tragedy after tragedy or experiencing all of these issues and seeing all of this news. It's so overwhelming and so traumatic. And especially now with COVID-19, it seems like our entire nation is going through this collective trauma. Not only that, but being physically separated from other people. We need to pay attention to our mental health now more than ever. And that means destigmatizing the discussions around mental health and recognizing that all of us struggle at times with mental health and communicating with the people around you about how you're feeling. And most importantly, reaching out when you need help. So yes, opening up this discussion about mental health is absolutely critical in when we're discussing how we're going to dismantle these systems of oppression, because mental health issues are the direct result of these systems of oppression. So we need to start investing in local community programs and organizations that can help to support people and recognize the trauma that communities have faced as a result of racism and oppression that are rampant in this country.
And Amanda, I think something also that is also important, and when we did the commemoration last year, one of the things that we were very adamant about highlighting is the fact that the person who pulled the trigger on El Paso, like so many shooters, it was not mental health that made them do it. It was hate that made him do it. And that it's very important for us to make sure that we differentiate the two, because oftentimes they are compounded into one. And in the conversation, I think that, Congresswoman, that you were mentioning, it's also very important to highlight when we say that the El Paso shooting was a national terrorist attack on American soil. Those are not our words. That is what the FBI classified it. In fact, it was the second largest terrorist attack on our country's soil by white nationalists since the Oklahoma City bombing. And the tragedy was that one of the reasons we're having these conversations today, why the Congresswoman is highlighting the importance of commemorating these tragedies, is that in the Latino community, oftentimes we are portrayed as if we've just arrived. We don't know our own stories. And if we don't know our own stories and we don't commemorate how we grieve or how we celebrate, then we have to reconstruct ourselves every single time and for every single election. And at Voto Latino, we deeply believe that that's enough, that we are all in this lucha together, and we have to speak truth to what is happening. So with that, I know that one of the biggest changes that we saw in Congress was a mobilization by young people to change what the fabric of Congress looked like, to reflect policies that it looked like. One of the pieces that you were able to pass, Congresswoman, as you were a part of, was background checks, the first comprehensive background checks bill in 25 years. Can you speak to what that is and where it is now?
Absolutely. And in fact, we've passed a number of pieces of legislation intended to keep people safe. It should not be controversial to want to be able to send your kids to school without worrying that they will be targeted by a gunman. It should not be controversial that people can go into a Walmart and go shopping without fear of being massacred. And you're right, Maria Teresa, we passed legislation in last spring, well over a year ago. We passed H.R. 8, our first piece of gun violence prevention legislation that calls for universal background checks. That is non-controversial. In fact, 90% of Americans, Democrats and Republicans alike, and gun owners support universal background checks. It doesn't take courage to pass this piece of legislation because it is so overwhelmingly supported. It was bipartisan coming out of the House. It's been sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk since early last year. We've also closed the Charleston loophole, that bill that is meant to also ensure that there are background checks and that there's that we're not allowing gun shows to sell, just as a workaround for gun buyers who don't want to wait for a gun check or a background check. We've also passed Disarm Hate, and there's much more work that we need to do. One of the things that I want people to understand about why these bills are so important, all of which are sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk, is because the destruction that impacts communities is far-reaching and long-lasting, and no one should have to go through what El Paso went through. In addition to the trauma that our community is going through, we're now taxpayers in one of the most economically disadvantaged communities in the country. Taxpayers are going to have to pay millions of dollars to prosecute the man who massacred people in this community. The injustice that continues in the months and the years after such a tragedy, no one should have to go through this. And so the idea is to prevent these things from continuing to happen. I'm also a strong supporter of banning AK-47s. I do not understand how those weapons are weapons that are available in our communities and in our neighborhoods. I've been talking to families. Those bullets from that AK-47 didn't cut through victims' bodies. They went into those bodies and shattered bones, shattered muscle, shattered nerve endings, shattered arteries. These victims are going to be living in physical pain for the rest of their lives with surgeries and physical therapies. There's no reason that those guns should be on our streets.
No, and so when you describe the physicality of the wounds that were encountered, one of the victims who will always resonate is the child that was shielded by the mother, who was shielded by the father to protect both of them, and he lost both his parents to this because of someone that had so much hate and used maximum force to deliver a message. And I think that that is what brings us to this conversation, but also you're illustrating it. Oftentimes people don't realize that it is meant to, it is not even a weapon meant for hunting. It is one to cause maximum pain in the middle of a war zone. And we are not in a war zone in America. We are not to be turning these types of weapons against each other. And so I guess this is where, and I want to bring Brianna into the conversation and Amanda, when we talk about the importance of participation and about changing legislation and bringing in people that vote our values, the Congresswoman already illustrated 3 pieces of legislation that have been passed and that are summarizing changing who has access to these types of weapons. Talk about the importance of mobilization, because this type of policy does not happen in a vacuum. Talk a little bit about the importance of mobilization from the perspective of not just a young person, but of people who sometimes say, it actually doesn't matter if I sit this out or not. Brianna?
Yeah, so I think when we mobilize and when we engage in the political process, it helps shape certain boundaries. So I know I mentioned that the El Paso massacre was a deadly combination. You had racism and hate fueled by white supremacy and a person who had access to a civilian version of an AK-47. So when we think about, mobilization, you're able to work on the issues that directly impact you and impact your community. You're able to advocate and lobby towards your legislators, asking them to put common sense bans and laws into place around guns that cause this maximum damage, like the Congresswoman mentioned earlier. And when you mobilize and you advocate, you're able to show how important these issues are. There's this idea of accountability in Congress where your representatives are directly accountable to you because you put them into office. Mm-hmm. So in this space at Voto Latino and March for Our Lives, we're, pushing for, bills that make sense for our community, really bringing people power, whether that's calling our representatives, emailing them, letting them know that, we want to create laws around gun violence prevention, or we want to really rein in the racist rhetoric used against the Latinx community. So it's this, holistic whole 360-degree approach where we're, engaging people power, working in the legislative space, and also using government to hold people accountable.
And Amanda, what is your perspective of what you've seen?
Oh yeah, Brianna, I completely agree. I love how you mentioned that our representatives are supposed to represent us. That's not a revolutionary idea. We can't have openly racist elected officials and elected officials who are backed by the NRA or who don't think that saving lives is their job. Those people don't represent us. It's our power at the voting box to be able to kick them out. We need to vote out all of the leaders that stand in the way of creating a just and peaceful society because they're failing to protect our lives. That's why voting is critical. It determines who answers our calls for justice and who and how they will respond. Are they going to respond with more guns and violence and hatred, or are they going to respond with peace and justice? We have to think about this not only at the presidential level, but also at every single level of elections. That means local elections, that means city council elections, that means statewide representatives, and of course, the president. We need to be thinking about peace and justice and who's going to answer our calls and our cries, and make sure we're electing in people that represent us.
So, Representative Castro, you're hearing it from the outside. Two women who are pushing the envelope, asking for more people to come in and participate in this discussion. But it's clearly about allyship. Who are your allies on this front in Congress?
On trying to remove the obstacles.
Yes.
Thankfully there are so many great allies that I have. On this and many other issues. This morning I received a beautiful early morning text from mis dos comadres, 2 of my most beloved allies and mis hermanas del Congreso, Sylvia Garcia from Houston and Purcell Powell from Miami, 2 incredibly powerful women, powerful voices who really are never afraid to stand up and call out the hate and the racism in front of us. And I have to tell you, it's especially courageous of someone like Debbie Mukersel-Powell, who is considered a frontline member. And a frontline member, for those of you at home who don't know what a frontline member is, it's someone in a vulnerable district, someone who has a seat that easily could flip from a current Dem to a Republican. And you frequently see frontline members being very cautious about what they say and how they react. And Debbie is never afraid to call out racism or hate. Same thing with Sylvia, who is so powerful in her voice and in how clearly she sees these things. And then together, calling the point of calling out hate and calling out division and calling out racism is that when you don't do it, you give it cover and you give it power and you allow it authority. And so our silence emboldens it. So they are tremendous allies. And, I've been working with groups and organizations in general to get out the vote, because honestly, this election, and I know we say that frequently about various elections.
No, this is it. There's no plan B. Let's all be clear. This is the election.
This is the election, and our lives literally depend on this election. Someone put it into perfect perspective. The current occupant of the White House really has spent the vast majority of his presidency on the golf course. And so very little of that time actually governing. But in that brief time he's been in the White House, look at the destruction that he has wrought on our democracy. Look at the incredible cruelty that he has used against communities of color. Look at the inhumane way that he has treated vulnerable migrants. There could be, there are innumerable reasons why the current occupant presents a clear and present danger to us going forward. So, the work to remove obstacles includes, stepping up, running for office. It includes supporting good candidates who are upholding and living and legislating your values. This election is one of those where nobody can sit home on their couch and hope that things will change. Every single person who sees the inhumanity of this administration needs to get up off their couch and make sure that you're getting everybody to the polls on November 3rd, that they're voting early. We've got to make sure that as many people as possible, vote early, because we want to ensure that there's not the nightmare election day scenarios that we've seen play out already in other parts of the country. But thankfully, thank God, lots of great allies.
So, and I think that to that point, I want to bring up that one of the things that we are, Voto Latino, obviously deeply believe in is that if we enfranchise ourselves, we're able to make policy change. But it is what you were sharing. All of us must participate to make that change. 123 million Americans sat it out last time, expecting someone else to make the change for them. So we do need to register to vote. We need to talk to each other about what change is possible. And we need to do it in allyship. And with that, Congresswoman, how have you seen El Paso change specifically from then to now? And what are those tools and lessons of resilience that we can share with other folks that right now may be suffering?
Well, we've seen a significant increase in voter registration, which, it hasn't happened alone. But part of that, I do believe there has been some organic component of that. There also has been, there's been incredible work by organizations like Voto Latino. So that's a great sign. It's a sign that makes me hopeful that people are going to use their voice and their power at the ballot box, but we're going to do everything possible in the next 90 plus days to make sure that happens. But I have also we've seen in the weeks that followed, people opening up their checkbooks, their pocketbooks, contributed $11 million to helping the victims and the families and everybody suffering. One of the poorest communities in the nation, one of the most economically disadvantaged communities in the country, always opening up our hearts, opening up our pocketbooks. We didn't just do it for the victims of August 3rd. We did it in the months and months that preceded, as we were offering hospitality and care for the migrants who were arriving at our front door. And so we've seen that continued charity, which is, again, also an incredible sign of hopefulness. But we are seeing volunteer fatigue. So as an example, the local food bank is in constant need of volunteers. And this is a community, as I mentioned early on, that has shouldered tremendous burdens now for years, compound trauma, and along with those burdens. So we're seeing some volunteer fatigue. You know, I think people feel a little bit emotionally spent out, and it's totally to be expected.
Right.
Yeah, and you know, I think one of the things that I'm worried about is what's happening during COVID and the isolation, and not being able to hug one another, hold one another, comfort one another during times of great crisis, because that's who Latinos are, right? We embrace, we hug, we hold each other tight. You know, just earlier today, this morning, as I was at one of the community events, to suppress that overwhelming desire to comfort someone who is in tears, it was so difficult. So, you know, we're seeing some wonderful, incredible, continued hopefulness. But, you know, the reality is also people are exhausted emotionally, mentally, physically. There's financial hardship. You know, as again, the Senate dithers, as people are going without an income, people are unemployed, people don't have access to healthcare. We live in one of those states that were with a governor who refused to expand access to the Affordable Care Act. You know, we need help. I'm gonna keep fighting for that. I'm gonna keep fighting for those resources. But we've got to recognize where the obstacles are. The obstacles have been Senate Republicans. The obstacle has been the occupant of the White House. We need justice. We need equity. We need compassion back in our government. This is just.
And I think you stressed something that it's if folks right now are feeling overwhelmed and feel spent, you're not at a loss. It's okay. We are experiencing right now a period of mourning, but we also recognize that we are living in a pandemic. Many of us have lost jobs in healthcare. We're seeing civil rights unrest that we haven't seen in the 1960s. It's all coming together. But I think that as a result, we're also seeing people pay attention in a different light. And it's that different light, at least that's what we're seeing, Congresswoman, at Voto Latino. We had registered we expected to register roughly about 20,000 people, for example, in the month of June. And when we started translating what was happening with the riots from George Floyd to protesting and voting, we saw over a 2,700% increase of participation. And of that, close to 85%, 87,000 people that we registered in the month of June actually came from Texas. So people are making that connection. But I think you pinpoint something really important. And this is the idea of not just the people mourning, but also the people who are part of the support system that we often depend on as nonprofits. That is the volunteer network, that there is fatigue. And I want to bring in Brianna and bring in Amanda to talk a little bit about how do you address that volunteer fatigue? How do we re-energize ourselves? Because it is absolutely hard. We are absolutely living in the most difficult times in our most recent generation's history. Yet I deeply believe that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. We're almost there in November, but we need to figure out how do we talk and speak to that resilience. So how do you mobilize those volunteers, Brianna?
It's challenging. You have people who, are dealing on a day-to-day basis with really traumatic issues, whether it be the El Paso shooting, whether it be lack of access to healthcare, whether it be losing a job that your family really needs so you can afford to put food on the table. Mm-hmm. So I think, being able to acknowledge that these are real challenges, provide time for people to, take care of themselves, access resources like the ones that the Congresswoman mentioned for mental health, go to food banks to acquire the food that is needed, seek out community resources, and then not get lost in the day-to-day challenges, but also tie back, that heartbreak and these challenges to direct action, which is voting, which is protesting, to showing up for long-term changes in your community. So that way people don't have to, deal with the lack of Medicare, Medicaid, because the Texas governor refused to expand it a couple years ago. So that way people have access to mental health care and don't have to pay exorbitant prices for it. So that way people have jobs in their communities that can provide for their families, and they're not struggling on a $7.25 minimum wage. It really is this, long-term approach, and the challenge is, not taking your eye off of that while also dealing with day-to-day, very real circumstances that are meant to keep you oppressed and keep you down in these challenges.
I mean, how do you mobilize volunteers?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of the times when people recognize the urgency in a situation, it's an internal drive that a lot of our volunteers have. We have some volunteers that have been working with us for over 2 years now. And when you stop and you sit down and you ask them, why have you maintained this energy over the past 2 years? It's because they know they have to keep fighting. I mean, we've said this 1,000 times, but this is the election. This is the election year. And even throughout all of these tragedies and all of the unrest this summer, there's so much energy. There's so much energy because it feels like something is finally shifting. Something is finally clicking in so many people's heads that things need to change, and that the status of the world right now is unacceptable.
Can we underscore that? The status of the world right now is unacceptable.
Shift.
I'm all in for that. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's about feeling that. And I mean, that in itself kind of sounds, it's a little depressing to think about that. But within that, there's this little seed of hope. There's a seed of hope within you when you see, when I turn on the news and I see all the people protesting, when I go to my local city council and I see hundreds of thousands of my neighbors out there fighting, it's just that spark within me that says, what you're doing is working, keep it up. And I think a lot of people feel that right now, but it's still very important to reflect as an individual and recognize what time you need for yourself. We say all the time, self-care is a radical action. It's radical to take time for yourself when all of these pressures of the world are pulling you this way and that. So it's about finding that balance between taking care of yourself and fighting for others.
And I deeply believe that the only way we do that is by collective action and knowing when you have to tap in and when you tap out, and making sure that you can pass that baton, Amanda. And I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. So what we'll do now is there's a couple of questions in the queue. I will go ahead and then ask them to you all, and then we'll do some closing remarks. And we have about 12 more minutes for the conversation. So I want to talk a little bit about one of the first questions that's flagged. How are things looking so far with respect to signing Latinos to vote? We have powerful numbers. Can we flip the presidency and the Senate? And Brianna, so this is the work that you do day in and day out. Why don't you take it?
So I love this question because it has an easy answer. Things are looking really good for the Latinx community if we continue with our foot on the gas. The reason for that is that the Latinx community will comprise the second largest voting bloc this election. It'll be 32 million strong, where about half of that is currently registered. So we have to, register 15 to 16 million. As Maria Teresa mentioned, we saw almost 90,000 people in Texas in the month of June get registered to vote at Voto Latino. So we know that there's an appetite and there's an interest. It really is reaching out to your family, your friends, your community, and letting them know that registering to vote is a solution to a lot of the day-to-day challenges that we're facing. And once our folks get registered to vote, making sure that your gente actually turns out, making sure that you either request your ballot by mail if you're able to do so in your state, making sure that you show up for early voting so that way the lines are a little bit shorter and you're able to practice safe social distancing, and also turning out on election day. So there are a lot of things that are empowering the Latinx community if we take advantage and move on them.
And that was perfectly done, Brianna. And Congresswoman, what would it mean to the state of the country if we were able to flip the Senate and the White House to your work?
Well, number one, we'd be saving the soul of the country.
That's not small at all. That's not small at all.
Right. That minor thing, like we're saving ourselves, number one. But number two, I will tell you, I feel the same level of cautious but very hopeful optimism that Brianna mentioned. But with the caveat, as she mentioned, we've got to keep our foot on the gas. We have to wake up on November 4th completely exhausted and P.S. very hungover because we've been celebrating all night. But I have to tell you, I feel.
Can I wait 3 days? I think I want to sleep first, and then I'll be really.
I think that we will flip Texas. I feel that cautiously optimistic. One of the things that we did in 2018 was after we won our primary, my campaign focused on reaching out to, we did voter registration, but also really concentrated heavily on low propensity Democratic voters as another way to grow our base. And, especially for Latinos who have felt disenfranchised, ignored, unappreciated, those are hard conversations. It takes a lot of resources, a lot of, you've really got to build up your defense because, people are upset and angry and understandably so. But with those folks that you can break through to, and then once you connect to them and get them to the polls, it's more likely they will keep coming back.
That's right.
If you can get them for at least 3 elections, they're going to keep coming back. And so our goal was to double turnout from midterm to midterm in 2018 using this approach, raised a lot of money for it, did a lot of work, a lot of knocking on doors, and we exceeded our expectations. And all those areas where we had really focused on and where we told people, you matter, your vote matters, your future matters. Those tough conversations, those important conversations proved very fruitful. And so we're doing it again this time. We're going to be collaborating with other border communities. It is my hope that the blue wave runs through the border. We say to the country, we will not be dehumanized anymore or ever again. And we're going to prevent that through our votes and through our activities at the ballot box. So I'm feeling cautiously optimistic. I'm excited about this election. Yeah, but we've got to work our asses off.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things the Latino community we know how to do is we're resilience, but we know la lucha and we know how to get it done. And I have to tell you that I am also cautiously optimistic because I can share with you, at least in the work of Voto Latino, Beto O'Rourke lost with 200,000 votes. Voto Latino, as of this morning, we have registered over 132,000 new Texans. And we are very, very clear that once we flip that state, we actually have a roadmap for the future of the country. And I am with you. The Southern Texas has been so long forgotten, and we're not forgetting. We're not forgetting the sacrifice, the work that they do every single day to make sure that there's resilience. And so we want to bring them into the conversation. But what an incredible point in history if we could say that it went through the southwest of Texas. I am by Texan by heart, believe it or not. I deeply believe in all of you. And Amanda, I want to talk because I think with that spirit of resilience and of opportunity, what opportunity do you see come in the November election?
I mean, there's so much opportunity here. We had a little glimpse of our future in 2018 when we flipped the House. And when that happened, we saw the number of people that went out to vote increase exponentially. And I'm just so excited to see where that energy is taking us, because we've kept that energy up since 2018. In fact, I think it's grown immensely. And when we're already seeing voter turnout among young people, among Latino voters, among all of these different voting demographics, when we saw that happen in a midterm, that's how you know that there's this amazing change ready to happen in this country. And I am so ready for it. I'm so ready to show up with all of my friends, with all of my family at the ballot box and make real change happen.
That's super exciting. As we're making the conclusion of this, what is one thing that each of you would like to leave our audience? Amanda, Brianna, I will start with you, then Amanda, and then the Congresswoman.
I think the El Paso community suffered great heartbreak on August 3rd, 2019, and we continue to see that, feel that, and experience it. But I want to share with everyone that there's hope in that heartbreak. There's a pathway to building the future that we want to see, to electing representatives like Congresswoman Escobar, who are willing to stand up for our community, who acknowledge our humanity, who acknowledge the changing demographic of the United States and realize that the power lies in our community. So I am really grateful for everyone who tuned in. Please visit votolatino.org/El Paso to donate to the Victim Scholarship Fund that is set up for the families of El Paso who, suffered in this massacre, and also continue pushing for justice, equity, and a better America.
Amanda?
Yeah, I think it's so easy to get discouraged when this fight is drawn out so long, and a lot of us have been fighting for a really long time now. But we need to recognize, as young people, as Latinos, as a wonderful American community, that we hold the power to vote out terrible elected leaders and vote in wonderful people who are going to create a peaceful society. We have that power, so we need to use it. And that means going out and registering everyone you know to vote. I mean, instead of saying hello, we should say, hi, how are you? Are you registered to vote? I can tell you that our entire March for Our Lives team is going to be out there on the ground driving action to get young people registered to vote and motivated to vote, right alongside amazing organizations like Voto Latino. But even as an individual, you have to recognize that you have that power and you need to use it.
Amen to that. And Congresswoman, I leave you with the last word.
Well, thank you so much, Maria Teresa, for hosting us. Thanks to Voto Latino, Brianna, Amanda. So wonderful to be on this conversation with you, you mighty mujeres. And, today is a tough day, but conversations like this give me tremendous hope for our future, for our country. We've got to remember why today is such a terrible day, what led up to this tragedy, and the fact that we can prevent other communities from having to live through this kind of pain and trauma. It is all within our own power. We have to use that power. We have to inspire everyone around us to use that power. And together we will create the change that our communities deserve, and live in a world and a country really worthy of people like those here in El Paso.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And as we conclude today's conversation, I really want to recognize the fact that we are having this conversation because 23 innocent people lost their life. They lost their life needlessly. They were going about their business. They were celebrating being with their families, enjoying a day in the middle of the summer. And so today at Voto Latino, we commemorate those deaths, but we also lean on the Mexican proverb that when they killed us, they didn't realize that they thought they buried us, but they didn't realize they were planting seeds. I want to thank the coalition of individuals from March for Our Lives, from the NAACP, and so many others that have participated today. I want to thank our influencers, Los Tigres del Norte, Luis Fonsi. We are a village that is coming to mourn El Paso together, but also recognize that this is not the end of a mobilization, but the beginning of change that we expect to come in November. I want to thank the Congresswoman for your fierce fight for always speaking truth, for standing up strong for the community. Amanda, if I could only bottle up all of your energy and duplicate it everywhere, I know that the resilience would be there, but more importantly, the tenacity to make change. Brianna, this is a particularly important time for you, but also a painful time. Thank you for your leadership at Voto Latino, making sure that what happened in El Paso does not stay in El Paso, but is continuing to mobilize millions of other Latinos in this country. As we mourn the horrendous loss of life that took place a year ago, I wanted to draw everybody's attention to the things we heard from our panelists today. There's a tidal wave of mobilization and motivation moving through this country. In our heartbreak, we create change. As we seek to stop the cycle of violence and death that hangs over Black, Latinx, and other communities of color, we know what we must do to reach that brighter future we all seek. I want to extend my gratitude to everyone who joined us today, to our panelists, and my love to all the people in El Paso. It's real, gente. And shout out to my family who's there right now. And this is a personal for all of us. May we not forget, again, the 23 people who lost their lives, who were injured, and may we mourn together. But tomorrow it's time to roll up our sleeves and to have action, because together we're in la lucha. Thank you, everyone.